Okay, let's unpack this. When you think of the 20th century in art, one name immediately leaps out, a name synonymous not just with painting, but with artistic revolution itself. We are diving deep today into the life, the chaos, and the monumental legacy of Pablo Picasso.
And monumental is precisely the right word, especially if we measure it in sheer volume. We have to start with his output. When Picasso died in 1973 at the age of 91, his estate was not just large as a staggering inventory.
Staggering's putting it mildly.
Over 45,000 unsold works. That included 1,885 paintings, 1,228 sculptures, and then, thousands upon thousands of ceramics, drawings, and prints.
45,000 pieces. It's a number that defies comprehension, really. It suggests not just talent, but a perpetual, relentless energy. Our mission today is a shortcut to understanding this human engine of creativity.
Right.
How one man could move so rapidly through styles, the intense, often catastrophic relationships that fueled his periods, and how his art became a literal, vast pictorial autobiography.
It's an exploration of constant transformation. I mean, unlike many masters who spend decades refining a signature style, Picasso embraced multiplicity. He himself stated in 1923 that his different manners of expression, that they must not be considered as an evolution.
So not a straight line from A to B.
Not at all. He saw them as different, simultaneously available ways of conveying his subjects. It was a toolbox, not a ladder.
Absolutely. He was always shifting, always in motion. And just to start this whole journey, here is an initial fact drop for you to chew on, revealing the depth of his Spanish roots. Get ready for his full birth name.
Oh, this is always a good one.
Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paulo Juan Nepomuceno María de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso.
That is quite the invocation. It speaks to a deep historical and cultural background, doesn't it?
I think we can all agree he made the correct editorial decision, sticking with just Picasso. But what's even more fitting is the story his mother told about his very first words. They weren't mama or papa.
No, they were peas.
Exactly. A shortening of lápiz, the Spanish word for pencil. He was quite literally born with the drive to create.
So a perfect place to begin is with those formative years in Spain where that drive was first channeled.
So we begin our deep dive into the man who insisted on radical change with a look at his formative years in Spain. He was born in Malaga in 1881 to a comfortable middle-class family, and the initial blueprint for his genius was handed down by his father, José Ruiz y Blasco.
His father was instrumental, providing that crucial early foundation. José Ruiz wasn't just a painter specializing in detailed naturalistic depictions of birds and game. He was also a professor of art and a museum curator.
So art was the family business.
In a way, yes. This meant young Pablo received intensely formal training from the age of 7 in oil painting and figure drawing. It was the rigid academic curriculum. Disciplined copying of masters and drawing from plaster casts.
And the genius manifested almost instantly, so much so that it seems to have, stifled his father's own ambition. There is that famous anecdote, the moment of artistic parricide, if you will, that really sets the tone for Picasso's entire career.
The famous pigeon sketch, yes. José Ruiz was working on an unfinished naturalistic sketch of a pigeon. The 13-year-old Pablo finished it with such precision and technical mastery.
Just picked it up and finished it.
Yes, demonstrating a command of realism that exceeded his father's own capabilities. The story goes that José Ruiz supposedly vowed to give up painting right there and then, believing he had been surpassed. He handed his brushes to his son.
Wow. Can you imagine that moment as a father? It's a powerful narrative about a child's talent just consuming the father's career.
That kind of talent meant that at 13, when the family moved to Barcelona after the tragic death of his younger sister Conchita from diphtheria, the standard path simply wasn't applicable to him.
That move must have been shadowed by grief.
Absolutely. And this is where we see his immense skid. In Barcelona, his father convinced the School of Fine Arts to let the 13-year-old attempt the entrance exam for the advanced class.
An exam meant for older, more experienced students.
Exactly. This exam was designed to take students a full month to complete, requiring immense discipline and time. Picasso finished the entire portfolio in 1 week.
1 week.
And was immediately admitted by the jury. He simply possessed an accelerated understanding of classical form.
But the rigor of the classroom, the structure, it quickly grated on him. He wasn't made for structured learning.
No, the institutional environment didn't hold his interest at all. At 16, he tried to attend Madrid's prestigious Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando, the country's foremost art school, but he disliked the formal instruction, the lectures, and the traditional curriculum so much that he He stopped attending classes.
But this wasn't wasted time. It was self-directed education, right?
Exactly. He used his time in Madrid to immerse himself in the Prado Museum. He studied the Spanish masters, critically analyzing the techniques of Velázquez, Goya, and Zurbarán, and crucially, he developed a profound admiration for El Greco.
El Greco's style is so dramatic. What was it about him that resonated with the young, rebellious Picasso?
It was the drama, the spiritual intensity, the arresting use of non-naturalistic color, and those elongated, often exaggerated figures. Picasso absorbed that sense of drama and, I think, structural distortion.
You can see this mastery of form in his early output from the mid-1890s, where he proves his academic pedigree.
Oh, absolutely. We see that pure academic realism in paintings like The First Communion from 1896, depicting his sister Lola. But the one that really stunned the critics was the portrait of his aunt.
Portrait of Aunt Peppa.
Yes, also from 1896. This piece, completed when he was just 15, has been lauded as, without a doubt, one of the greatest portraits in the whole history of Spanish painting. It shows an almost unsettling psychological penetration and an absolute command of light and shadow.
So he proved he could play the academic game flawlessly.
And once he proved it, he immediately started to break the mold. The transition begins very quickly.
How so?
By 1897, we see a shift towards symbolist influence. He's moving away from naturalistic color in favor of dramatic violet and green tones. Then, as the century turns, from 1899 to 1900, he enters his modernist phase.
So he's absorbing everything around him.
He's sponge. He's incorporating influences from Toulouse-Lautrec's decadent Parisian nightlife, the pre-Raphaelite intensity of Rossetti, the symbolist darkness of Munch, all filtered through that dramatic distortion he learned from El Greco.
And this absorption culminates in his first trip to Paris in 1900, which fundamentally changes his trajectory.
Paris was the center of the universe for art. He was desperately poor there, sharing an apartment with the journalist Max Jacob. The conditions were so dire that during the winter, they actually resorted to burning some of his earliest drawings and sketches just to keep the apartment warm.
Imagine burning your own work to survive. That period of struggle must have instilled a fierce drive for distinction. And this leads to his first major act of professional self-creation, dropping the name Ruiz.
It was a strategic, conscious choice. He transitioned from signing his works Pablo Ruiz Picasso to simply Picasso. Ruiz was a common, anonymous Spanish surname.
So he needed to stand out.
He did. His Catalan friends, who naturally used his less common maternal surname, encouraged the change. By adopting Picasso, he ensured that his identity was unique, memorable, and absolutely unmistakable as he stepped onto the world stage.
And the change becomes official right at the beginning of the new century.
Yes. The first issue of Arte Jovena magazine he co-founded in Madrid in 1901 was the first public platform where he officially signed his work simply as Picasso. He had shed his father's identity and created his own brand, perfectly timed for the dawn of his groundbreaking periods.
That new, distinct name acts like a clean slate, perfectly setting the stage for the dramatic, emotional shifts of the first decade of the 20th century. We move now into the foundational periods that laid the groundwork for Cubism.
And we begin with the one that is synonymous with pathos, the Blue Period, from 1901 to 1904. It's defined by a restrictive palette of somber shades of blue and blue-green, used almost monochromatically.
And this wasn't just an aesthetic choice, was it? It was driven by profound tragedy and social awareness?
Precisely. The dominant mood of melancholy was directly triggered by the suicide of his close friend, Carlos Casagemas, who shot himself over an unrequited love in 1901. Picasso was heartbroken. This personal mourning combined with the stark realization of social poverty during a trip through Spain.
So his subject matter shifts entirely to reflect this emotional landscape. The world literally looked blue to him.
It did. He focuses intensely on the marginalized. The figures of the doleful, the prostitutes, the beggars, and gaunt mothers clutching children. Works like The Old Guitarist are perfect examples, showing a wretched, blind man whose angular body is rendered in these chilling, elongated blue tones.
The theme of blindness, as you noted, is central here. It suggests not just physical affliction, but profound social or spiritual despair.
Yes, we see in The Frugal Repast an etching that shows two figures, one blind, one sighted but emaciated, sharing a bare table. It's a crucial emotional chapter, but Picasso, ever the quick-change artist, doesn't linger.
No, he never does. By 1904, the mood shifts entirely into the Rose period. This change is palpable. The desolate streets give way to the atmosphere of the traveling circus.
And the color palette follows suit, lightening dramatically. We move from the chilling, somber blues and greens to optimistic oranges, pinks, and warmer earth tones.
And the subjects?
The central subjects are the saltimbanques, the circus people, acrobats, and harlequins. This shift is often attributed to a changing personal life and the beginning of his warm, romantic relationship with his first significant mistress, Fernande Olivier.
The Harlequin figure is particularly interesting. It's a tragicomic symbol, the jester who makes others laugh while carrying his own pain.
It becomes a profoundly personal symbol for Picasso himself, the transient artist, moving between worlds, perhaps masking an inner vulnerability beneath a dazzling exterior. It's during this rose period, too, that his professional standing solidifies dramatically.
Right, and this is thanks to his connection with key American patrons. I'm talking about Leo and Gertrude Stein, of course.
Gertrude Stein, in particular, became his principal patron. She acquired many of his works and exhibited them in her celebrated informal salon in Paris. This wasn't just about sales, it was about prestige and intellectual validation.
And that salon was a hub for everyone who was anyone in the art world.
Exactly. It was at one of her gatherings in 1905 that Picasso met the established master of modern color, Henri Matisse.
That meeting sparked what the sources called a lifelong fruitful rivalry.
It did. Matisse was the leader of Fauvism, the wild beasts, who prioritized pure, vibrant color over drawing and perspective. Seeing Matisse's daring use of color certainly motivated Picasso, who was still refining his drawing-based approach, to push further into radical styles.
But the true catalyst for the revolution that would follow was not a person, it was an artifact.
It was. This brings us to 1907, the African art influence, and the start of proto-Cubism with the explosive painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
This painting is the moment modern art detonated. It was a confrontation with the history of Western painting, a 5-figure composition of female nudes. Initially, the 3 figures on the left were influenced by Iberian sculpture's simple monumental forms.
But then the sources mention his visit to the Ethnographic Museum at Palais de Trocadero.
Yes, in June 1907, Picasso visited the museum dedicated to indigenous art. He was profoundly struck by the power of African artifacts, particularly the masks. What fascinated him was the functional nature of the masks.
Functional how?
They weren't just art to be looked at. They were tools for ritual, shields against the unknown, a way to channel power.
And he immediately went back and repainted the 2 figures on the right, giving them those shocking, aggressive, and geometrically fractured mask-like faces.
Exactly. He had shattered the Western tradition of representing the female form as soft, idealized, and passive. He replaced it with something primal, geometric, and jarring. The reaction from his friends and acquaintances, including Matisse, was near universal shock and revulsion.
Matisse angrily dismissed it as a hoax. Why was the painting so offensive to his peers? It wasn't just the subject matter, was it?
No, it was the abandonment of a single perspective. The figures are fractured and seen from multiple angles simultaneously. It was perceived as a violent, ugly assault on aesthetic sensibilities.
So controversial that he didn't even show it for years.
No, he actually kept the canvas rolled up in his studio and refused to exhibit Les Demoiselles publicly until 1916, nearly a decade later. Yet it's those formal ideas hammered out in that proto-Cubist confrontation that lead directly into the full-blown Cubist movement.
And that leads us into the heart of the revolution, Cubism, from 1909 to 1919. This is where Picasso and Georges Braque truly established themselves as co-founders of what many consider the single most important movement of the 20th century.
We break Cubism into 2 main phases. Let's start with the first, analytic Cubism, running roughly from 1909 to 1912. The name analytic implies a rigorous intellectual process.
It was defined by a systematic analysis of objects. The artist took objects, say a guitar, a bottle, or a person, and broke them down into component geometric planes and facets.
So instead of seeing an object as a snapshot from one angle, they were trying to represent the object as it exists in space and time, seen from multiple viewpoints simultaneously, like walking around it and painting all views at once.
Precisely. It's an attempt to render the concept of the object, not just its appearance. To maintain this rigor, they reduced their palette drastically to monochrome, brownish, and neutral colors.
Why get rid of the color?
It forced the viewer to focus entirely on the structural complexity and the intellectual puzzle of spatial representation. Works like the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler are key here, often looking like shattered glass.
And their collaboration was so close that their works during this time are often considered almost indistinguishable.
They were working through a visual problem together. But Cubism couldn't remain purely academic and monochrome. By 1912, they shift into synthetic Cubism, and this transition involves an invention that changed art forever: collage.
Right, from analysis to synthesis, building up instead of breaking down.
Yes. They developed the technique of pasting cut paper fragments, newspaper, wallpaper, patterned oilcloth directly into the compositions. This introduction of real-world materials blurred the line between art and life.
And the piece that stands as the foundational Cubist collage, perhaps the first true assemblage, is Still Life with Chair Caning from 1912.
That work is revolutionary. It uses oil paint and printed oilcloth, designed to look like chair caning edged with actual rope. The caning is flat, but it's meant to represent texture and depth.
So it's a game of what's real and what's represented.
A total game. It introduces Trompe-l'oeil trick of the eye, but simultaneously negates it by using actual everyday material. This forced the viewer to confront the nature of representation itself.
Now, within this broader Cubist period, a microstyle emerged around 1915 to 1917, sometimes called crystal Cubism. It's defined by extreme geometric clarity.
This style, characterized by highly geometric and minimalist renditions of objects, pipes, glasses, was sometimes described as looking like hard-edged, square-cut diamonds. It's seen by many historians as Picasso's strategic response to the criticisms he was facing at the time.
Wait, criticism for what? He was the leading voice of modern art.
Yes, but as we'll see shortly, Picasso had already begun experimenting with classical representational styles at the same time he was painting Cubist pieces. Some critics saw this as a defection, a sign he was abandoning the rigor of the movement.
Ah, so crystal Cubism was him doubling down.
It reasserted that rigor, emphasizing the pure crystalline structure and intellectual foundation of the Cubist analysis, is an act of artistic self-defense.
But underpinning all this formal innovation was chaos in his personal life, right? He leaves Fernand Olivier for a woman named Eva Guel.
Marcel Humbert, known as Eva Guel. Picasso was deeply in love with her, and in a fantastic fusion of the personal and the abstract, he included declarations of his love for Eva, like "my Jolie, my pretty," directly into the geometric planes of his synthetic Cubist works.
A love note hidden in a puzzle. But tragedy strikes again, mirroring the end of the Blue Period.
Tragically, Eva died from illness in 1915 at only 30 years old, devastating Picasso, who had already suffered the loss of his sister and his friend Casa James.
And right in the middle of this immense creative output and personal tragedy, the bizarre high-stakes crisis of the Mona Lisa theft erupts in 1911.
This is truly a spectacular moment of celebrity drama. The Mona Lisa had been stolen from the Louvre. Initially, the police arrested the poet Guillaume Apollinaire.
And Apollinaire was his friend.
His close friend. The connection was an unscrupulous artist named Jerry Piret, who had a history of stealing ancient Iberian artifacts from the Louvre.
And Picasso had bought those stolen artifacts.
He had. He had acquired 2 stolen Iberian sculptures from Piret, which ironically had influenced the faces of the early figures in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Oh, wow.
So under intense police pressure, Apollinaire actually implicated his close friend Picasso, revealing that Picasso had the stolen goods.
So Picasso is arrested, questioned by the police, and facing potential conviction and deportation back to Spain. How did he handle the interrogation?
Fearing the worst, in an act he later regretted, Picasso denied knowing Apollinaire. The 2 men were held for a time, but eventually both were cleared of any involvement in the Mona Lisa theft itself.
But the sheer chaos of being entangled in the theft of the world's most famous painting while simultaneously inventing Cubism is a testament to the dramatic, high-wire act of his life.
And speaking of chaos, the world is plunging into World War I. Braque and other French colleagues are mobilized, but Picasso, as a Spanish citizen, was not required to fight.
That's a huge deal for art history.
Crucial. While the Cubist partnership fractured as Braque and Derain went to the front, Picasso continued painting uninterrupted throughout the war years. His work grew more somber, but his momentum never ceased. This allowed him to maintain his leading position.
When the war finally ended, his life underwent yet another dramatic change that pulled him away from the bohemian poverty of places like the Bateau Lavoir and into a world of wealth and formal society.
That shift brings us into the neoclassical period, covering 1919 through the mid-1920s. This aligns with a broader post-war movement across Europe known as the return to order.
A search for stability after the chaos.
Yes, and Picasso participated fully, producing work in a clear neoclassical style, recalling the purity of Ingres and the mastery of Raphael.
What specifically triggered this move into high society?
In 1917, Picasso became involved with Serge Diaghilev's famed Ballet Russes, designing costumes and sets. While working on the ballet parade in Rome, he met the Russian ballerina Olga Kokhlova. They married in 1918.
And Olga came from a wealthy, established background.
Entirely different from his world. She insisted on formal dinner parties, country estates, and the company of the Parisian wealthy elite. This lifestyle conflicted profoundly with Picasso's innate, restless bohemian nature, leading to massive, ongoing marital conflict,
They did have one son, Pablo Picasso.
who ironically grew up to be a motorcycle racer and his father's chauffeur, a blend of speed and service.
During this neoclassical phase, we see him painting those monumental figures, large, weighty, seemingly solid beings.
Yes, large, imposing works, like the massive Three Women at the Spring and Three Musicians, both from 1921. But this raises a fascinating question. How does one reconcile the Picasso, who is simultaneously painting analytical, fractured cubist puzzles, with the Picasso who's painting clear, volumetric, and massive neoclassical figures?
That's the genius of his methodology. He was never beholden to one style. But as the 1920s advanced, the formal solidity of neoclassicism couldn't contain his inner turbulence forever.
The radical energy returned in the mid-1920s when Surrealism emerged as the next great modern movement, focused on the unconscious mind and dreams. In 1925, the movement's leading writer, André Breton, famously declared Picasso one of ours in a defining article.
Now, we know Picasso never fully adopted the core surrealist method. What was that core method, and why did he reject it?
The core method was pure psychic automatism. The idea of creating art without any conscious thought or control, directly channeling the subconscious mind like automatic writing, but visual.
And Picasso was too much of a control freak for that.
He was a master of line and form. He always wanted to be the driver. He rejected that total abdication of control.
So he didn't adopt the methodology, but he certainly adopted the vocabulary.
Absolutely. The movement revived his attraction to primitivism, violence, and intense eroticism, all themes that had been suppressed during the formal neoclassical years. His imagery explodes with violence, psychic fears, and a savage eroticism.
And if the neoclassical phase was defined by the prim Olga, the surrealist period is defined by his golden muse.
Marie-Thérèse Walter. He met her in 1927 when she was just 17, near the Galeries Lafayette department store in Paris. He was 45 and still married to Olga.
So this was a secret affair.
A long, secret affair. Marie-Thérèse became the subject of his most sensuous and celebrated surrealist pieces, including the famous Le Rêve Girl Before a Mirror. She is the source of those colorful, voluptuous, curved figures that dominated his work in the early 1930s.
He later fathered a daughter, Maya, with her.
She represented a physical and emotional freedom that contrasted sharply with the formal constraints of his marriage to Olga. But this period also saw the introduction of a darker mythological figure that reflected the artist's own increasingly complex, violent psychology.
The Minotaur.
Yes. During the 1930s, the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull hybrid, replaced the Harlequin as his common motif. It's an archetype that embodies brute sexuality, violence, and passion, serving as a potent symbol for Picasso's own dual nature.
The creative genius and the possessive tyrant.
Exactly. This creature is featured extensively in his celebrated series of etchings, the Vollard Suite. So we have the golden-haired muse and the monstrous alter ego, all set against a backdrop of increasing political instability. That turbulence leads us directly into the period where his personal expression confronts the global stage.
And that confrontation is Section 5, the political awakening, focused almost entirely around the creation of the most recognizable anti-war icon in history, Guernica.
Before this, Picasso was generally apolitical in his art. What was the impetus that forced him to finally respond to the politics of the day?
The Spanish Civil War. When it began in 1936, it was the first time Picasso felt compelled to create an overtly political work, a condemnation of Franco and the fascists.
And the final horrifying impetus came on April 26, 1937, with the German bombing of the civilian city of Guernica.
That massive canvas, 25 feet wide, embodies the brutality, the suffering, and the hopelessness of that attack. And though the viewers were desperate for a narrative roadmap, Picasso famously refused to provide one.
He was adamant. He said, "It isn't up to the painter to define the symbols. The public who look at the picture must interpret the symbols as they understand them." He didn't want the work to be reduced to mere allegory. He wanted the visceral horror to resonate globally.
And the painting itself immediately became a powerful political tool, entrusted to the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
That trust was a direct political statement. Picasso explicitly requested that Guernica remain outside Spain until democracy and liberty were fully restored. It was a visible symbol of anti-fascist resistance and political exile for over 4 decades.
It only returned to Spain in 1981.
After Franco's death and the country's transition back to a constitutional monarchy.
Crucially, this period was heavily influenced by his romantic partner at the time, surrealist photographer Dora Maar.
Dora Maar was not just a muse. She was a French anti-fascist activist and a talented photographer in her own right. Her influence on the work is profound, starting with the very palette.
The black and white.
Yes. She likely suggested the monochrome scheme, which was a radical departure from his usual colorful style, but reflected her photographic practice, giving the painting a journalistic, immediate quality.
And she was physically involved in the creation, wasn't she?
She was a collaborator in the studio, having exclusive access during the entire process. She documented its evolution through a series of famous photographs, and our sources confirm that, at Picasso's direction, Dora Maar actually painted parts of the dying horse herself.
Her engagement, both artistic and political, was absolutely pivotal to the finished work. The Spanish Civil War quickly bled into World War II. Picasso remained in Paris during the German occupation, even though his art was considered degenerate by the Nazis.
He stayed, a defiant artistic presence in an occupied city. His art didn't fit the Nazi ideal, so he was banned from exhibiting publicly, and the Gestapo frequently harassed him, often raiding his studio.
Which brings us to perhaps the most legendary, defiant exchange of his career, the one about Guernica.
Yes. Upon seeing a photograph of the massive painting during a search of his apartment, a Gestapo officer asked, "Did you do that?" Picasso's response was immediate and scathing. "No, you did."
Incredible.
Despite the threat and the prohibition on casting bronze essential for sculpture, he continued working in secret, using smuggled bronze to produce major pieces like Still Life with Guitar and The Haunting, the Charnel House.
It speaks to a relentless, almost desperate need for expression that if he couldn't sculpt or paint freely, he would turn to other means.
He did. During the war years, he turned to writing, producing over 300 poems and 2 full-length plays. His creative engine simply could not be shut down, regardless of political oppression.
The sheer scope of this wartime output, combined with the stylistic shifts before it, was finally brought to the American public right on the cusp of the war, thanks to the MoMA retrospective in New York in 1939-1940.
This exhibition, organized by director Alfred Barr, was a landmark event that truly lionized Picasso in the United States and cemented his status as the unchallenged master of the modern age. However, the critical reaction was quite revealing.
It was mixed, even hostile in some quarters. Why, after decades of success, was his work still disturbing critics?
Critics at the time were still conditioned to expect stylistic consistency from a master. Picasso's multiplicity of styles, seeing Cubism, neoclassicism, and surrealism all side by side, was deeply unsettling.
It shattered the established notion of a coherent artistic identity.
Exactly. One critic famously summed up the confusion by calling him both a charlatan and genius at the same time. The sheer variety felt like inconsistency rather than adaptability.
That ambiguity is central to his final decades. Let's move into his late style, personal turmoil, and his political identity, covering the years from 1944 until his death in 1973.
This period is defined by intense productivity, the continuation of his radical style shifts, and, regrettably, increasing cruelty in his personal life, often linked to the intense age disparity in his relationships, beginning with Françoise Gillot.
Gillot was an art student, 40 years his junior, whom he began seeing in 1944, right after the liberation of Paris. She was the successor to Dora Maar, and they had 2 children together, Claude and Paloma.
The relationship highlighted the intense psychological danger of being close to him. Gillot is unique because she was the only woman who successfully chose to leave Picasso, departing in 1953. She cited his abusive treatment and myriad infidelities.
Her descriptions of the man are chilling. She famously wrote in her memoir that he believed he was God.
And in their discussions on women, she quoted him as saying that women are machines for suffering. She also noted he categorized them simply as goddesses and doormats.
It paints a picture of intense possessiveness and narcissism that she bravely broke free from. But even while he was with Gillot, the infidelities were constant.
Including a brief 6-week affair with Geneviève Laporte, who was 4 years younger than Gillot. As he moved into his 70s, this age gap and psychological tension found its way directly into his art.
The sources mention that his paintings frequently featured an old, grotesque dwarf as the lover of a beautiful young model.
Yes, the depiction of the grotesque, often clown-like, older male figure next to a vibrant, idealized young female became a recurring motif, a brutal, self-aware commentary on his own late-life reality and desires.
Shifting gears completely, this period also marks his most formal political commitment, joining the French Communist Party in 1944.
This commitment was highly complex and often contradictory. He was celebrated by the Soviet bloc, receiving the Stalin Peace Prize in 1950 and the Lenin Peace Prize in 1962. However, his communism was often viewed skeptically by his friends.
His dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, called his alignment sentimental rather than deeply ideological.
Suggesting Picasso wasn't versed in Marxist theory, and Picasso himself seemed to acknowledge the tension between his artistic freedom and political dogma.
He did. He stated, "I am a communist, and my painting is communist painting. But if I were a shoemaker, I would not necessarily hammer my shoes in a special way to show my politics."
He was making it clear that his revolutionary art style was not dictated by political realism, and we see that tension play out specifically with his portrait of Joseph Stalin.
Right. When he produced a portrait of Stalin in 1953, it drew severe criticism from the French Communist Party because it was insufficiently realistic.
They demanded the academic realism typical of Soviet art, yet Picasso had delivered an abstract, expressionistic rendering. He was too radical even for his political allies.
Nonetheless, his political identity yielded some of the most enduring symbols of the 20th century.
Without a doubt, his 1949 lithograph, Dove, was used for the World Peace Council and quickly became the globally recognized Dove of Peace, a massive, universally understood symbol. He also created the powerful and overtly political painting massacre in Korea in 1951.
As he entered his final decades, he moved away from inventing new forms and into a phase of deep artistic dialogue with the past.
The 1950s saw him produce massive reinterpretations of the old masters. He completed lengthy series based on Velázquez's Las Meninas, engaging with issues of light and composition. He also reinterpreted works by Delacroix, Goya, and Manet.
It was a fascinating process. The man who had shattered tradition was now entering into a formal conversation with it.
His personal life stabilized after he met Jacqueline Roque, a salesgirl at a pottery store. They married in 1961 and were together until his death.
And in 1967, his massive global impact took a physical public form in the United States with the unveiling of the Chicago Picasso, a 50-foot public sculpture. The figure itself remains famously ambiguous.
Picasso only offered a brief explanation, claiming the ambiguous form represented the head of an Afghan hound named Kabul. But what's more important than the subject is the gesture. He refused the $100,000 payment for the work, donating the sculpture to the people of Chicago.
Finally, we come to his last creative burst, the prolific torrent of work we mentioned at the start, between 1968 and 1971.
This final outpouring saw him produce hundreds of copperplate etchings and paintings. They were daring, wildly colorful, and intensely expressive. However, upon their initial showing, the critical community almost unanimously dismissed them.
They were called things like pornographic fantasies of an impotent old man and the slapdash works of an artist who was past his prime.
A profound misjudgment. The world wanted the Picasso they understood, the one who painted Cubism or neoclassicism. They couldn't immediately grasp this raw, often frantic expressionism.
It took decades for critics to catch up.
Yes, to fully reassess these final works, eventually realizing they were necessary precursors, actually prefiguring the rise of neo-expressionism in the 1980s.
That relentless pace of creation carried right up until the very end.
Absolutely. Picasso died on 8 April 1973 in Mougins, France. He was 91, succumbing to a heart attack brought on by pulmonary edema. He had been entertaining friends the night before and had been painting until 3 a.m.
A man who died with the work ethic of a 30-year-old. But his death triggered years of chaos, all because of one simple, fatal omission. He died without a will.
The omission of a will led to a huge, protracted, and incredibly bitter feud over his estimated $240 million estate. At the time, French law only recognized Paulo, his son with Olga Kuklova, as legitimate.
So his other children had to sue for their inheritance.
His illegitimate children, Maya, Claude, and Paloma, had to fight through the courts, eventually winning the legal right to share the estate, despite fierce opposition from his widow Jacqueline and his legitimate son Paulo.
The conflict was so intense and bitter that it resulted in some of the most tragic episodes associated with his life, the so-called Trail of Female Carnage. This is the part of the story that requires gravity and reflection.
The human cost of being in Picasso's orbit was immense. The women who were closest to him suffered immensely. His widow, Jacqueline Roque, and his former lover, Marie-Thérèse Walter, both tragically died by suicide years later.
His first wife, Olga Kuklova, and his partner, Dora Maar, both succumbed to severe nervous breakdowns. And the immediate family tragedy didn't end there either.
No. His grandson, Polito, committed suicide by ingesting bleach when Jacqueline Roque barred him from attending Picasso's funeral in 1973. And Pablo, Picasso's legitimate son, died from alcoholism and depression just 2 years later in 1975.
It is a heartbreaking and terrible postscript to a life of immense creative power, forcing us to consider the dual nature of the Minotaur figure he adopted, the genius and the beast.
As his granddaughter Marina Picasso later noted, his genius came at a terrible price for those who shared his life.
Before we look at the wider global legacy, let's circle back to his specific technical methods. Across those 50 years of constant change, what were the consistent technical threads?
A few things stand out as constants. Despite his intense use of color in many periods, he fundamentally relied on drawing or line rather than subtle color variations to create form and space. His work always began with the line. He also constantly experimented with the physical medium itself.
Meaning, he wasn't afraid to use non-traditional materials in his fine art.
Exactly. He sometimes added sand to his paint to vary the texture, giving the canvas an almost sculptural quality. And a fascinating analysis in 2012, using nanoprobe technology on the red armchair, confirmed that he frequently used common house paint.
So no snobbery about materials.
None. He was always willing to subvert traditional art materials to achieve his expressive goals. And finally, that almost obsessive habit of dating his works, often down to the day.
Which is a gift to art historians.
It reinforces the idea that Picasso's art constitutes a vast pictorial autobiography, giving critics and viewers an almost day-by-day timeline that directly links his output to his emotional state and current relationship. He was providing posterity with a comprehensive journal in paint.
That complete record sets the stage for our final look at his unparalleled global impact. The first massive consequence of his death, beyond the family feud, was on the world's museums.
The inheritance crisis resulted in a revolutionary solution. Since he died without a will, his heirs had to pay astronomical death duties to the French state. Instead of liquidating the collection, they paid these duties in kind, in the form of thousands of Picasso's own works.
And pieces he had collected?
Yes, and pieces from other masters, including Matisse. This collection forms the immense and representative core of the Musée Picasso in Paris, arguably the greatest single repository of his work.
And of course, there's the Museo Picasso in Barcelona, which focuses on his early years,
demonstrating that firm grounding in classical techniques from the 1890s we discussed earlier.
But there is one utterly unique moment in his legacy that speaks to how deeply his art resonated with ordinary people around the world, transcending the elite art market, the Basel vote.
This happened in Basel, Switzerland in 1968. A local Swiss insurance company, needing to cover reimbursements after an air disaster, decided to sell 2 of his paintings that were held at the Kunstmuseum Basel.
And the city didn't want to lose them.
The local population was outraged. They successfully petitioned and voted on a local referendum to raise the public funds necessary to purchase the Picassos for the museum. This was the first time in democratic history that a population voted directly on the purchase of public art.
That's phenomenal. How did Picasso react when he heard about this massive popular outpouring of support?
He was immensely touched. Informed of the decision, Picasso donated 3 additional paintings and a sketch to the city, and was later made an honorary citizen of Basel. It's a powerful story about art ownership belonging to the people.
Moving to the purely commercial side, it's safe to say Picasso remains the market's king.
He is consistently the top-ranked artist by auction sales. His paintings routinely set and break records. Garçon à la Pipe hit $104 million in 2004. Nude, Green Leaves, and Bust reached $106.5 million in 2010. And his Women of Algiers set an incredible record at $179.3 million in 2015.
Unfortunately, where there is that much value and that large an oeuvre, there is inevitably theft.
Tragically so. More of his paintings have been stolen than those of any other artist in history. In 2012, over 1,100 of his works were listed as stolen.
With such high stakes and such a massive body of work, the process of verifying authenticity must be incredibly complicated, especially given the family feuds.
It was a nightmare scenario for years. After his death, the disagreements among his heirs led to dual, competing authentication methods. To simplify and unify this chaotic situation, 4 of his surviving heirs established the Picasso administration in 2012 to handle all official authentication requests.
A necessary step to manage the legacy.
Absolutely. Claude served as the legal administrator until 2023, when his sister Paloma took over. This formal body is essential for managing the legacy of an artist whose output was so vast and scattered.
He truly left an immense footprint, not just in museums, but in global pop culture, too.
He certainly did. He's become an archetype. He's been portrayed by major actors, notably Anthony Hopkins in the film Surviving Picasso and Antonio Banderas in the Genius television series. He features in Woody Allen's film Midnight in Paris and Steve Martin's play Picasso at the Le Panagel.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the man whose name is now synonymous with modern art, what is the core insight we should walk away with? How do we summarize this life of relentless change?
The core insight is that Picasso's genius lay not in finding a single style, but in the intentional rejection of stylistic stasis. He was defined by perpetual motion and stylistic appropriation, using his art, that massive, meticulously dated pictorial autobiography, as a means of expressing his immediate emotional and political world.
So he didn't just adapt to modern movements.
He used his relationships, his politics, and his sheer volume of production to define them, even if the result was perceived as chaotic.
And that concept brings us back to the ultimate irony of his final years. Though he was lionized as the greatest living artist by 1939, his last massive and highly expressive outpouring of work was initially dismissed as the crude, slapdash fantasies of an old man past his prime.
The world thought they had defined Picasso, but he had already shifted to a place that critics couldn't yet understand. And the ultimate vindication of his final style is that future critics later redefined those works, the ones called crude and excessive, as the daring, necessary precursors to the entire neo-expressionist movement.
So here's the thought for you to carry forward, directly inspired by Picasso's trajectory. What does it mean for an artist's output to be so massive, so aggressively personal, and so rapidly produced that it takes decades for the world to catch up? What seemingly crude, excessive, or confusing works of contemporary art today might future critics eventually redefine as the necessary, daring precursors to the next great movement. Picasso showed us that the true measure of innovation is often only revealed when the world finally stops demanding evolution and simply accepts radical, constant change.